Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling a really interesting article that somebody sent in about monarchy.
Ooh, monarchy.
Yeah, specifically about how it might actually be uh, kind of a force for good by restraining both the masses and political extremes,
Whoa.
right?
Okay.
It's
God.
counterintuitive. Buckle up. This will be fun.
Yeah, this really flips the script on how we usually think about monarchy. So the paper we're looking at is an excerpt from Monarchy as Restraint. And the author argues that sometimes a monarch saying no can actually protect their people. It can be in their best interest, even if it's not popular.
That's a bold claim.
Yeah.
So to illustrate this point,
Mm-hmm.
the author uses Imperial Russia as a case study.
Yeah.
Specifically looking at Tsar Nicholas II and his relationship with groups like the Black Hundreds. Now, for context, imagine like a group that was fiercely devoted to the Tsar and the Orthodox Church, but also known for being, well, let's just say, enthusiastic by using violence to achieve their goals.
Yeah, the author seems to have some sympathy for some of the Black Hundreds' goals, but they also argue that the Tsar's opposition to this group was actually a way of protecting Russian society from their more volatile tendencies. They kind of paint this picture of Tsar Nicholas II as like a balancing force, trying to temper the extremes of both the far right, like the Black Hundreds, but also the left who are pushing for reforms inspired by Western democracies.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting. The author claims that Tsar Nicholas II eventually caved to pressure from the people pushing for these Western reforms,
Yeah.
and that this ultimately led to his downfall and the rise of the Bolsheviks, the communist revolutionaries who took over Russia. It's a real be careful what you wish for kind of situation.
It is. The author suggests that sometimes a monarch's yes can be more dangerous than their no. They even go as far as to say that the absence of a monarch in post-Soviet Russia paved the way for a resurgence of the far right.
Which, as we know, didn't exactly happen in the way that the author predicted. Instead, we got Putin, definitely authoritarian, but arguably more of a centrist figure.
That's right. Which makes you wonder if, in a way, Putin ended up unintentionally fulfilling that stabilizing role that the author attributes to monarchs.
It's food for thought.
It is.
Okay, so we've got a monarch potentially acting as a safeguard against extremes. Now, this leads us to one of the author's main arguments here. They say the main responsibility of the monarch is to say no to his people.
Wow.
Right?
That's a pretty provocative statement.
For sure.
So understand this. You have to see the world through the author's lens. They believe that people are easily swayed by trends and short-term desires. They use the example of, shifting public opinion on same-sex marriage in Canada, a relatively rapid shift in societal values. The author seems to imply that this speed of change can be detrimental.
So it's almost like the monarch is a steady hand on the wheel, resisting those sudden jerks that could send the whole ship off course.
Exactly. And they take it a step further by completely rejecting the idea of a constitutional monarchy, where a monarch's power is limited by a constitution. The author believes a true monarch should only answer to divine law.
Whoa.
That's pretty old school.
Yeah.
They argue that monarchs should act in the long-term best interests of the nation, even if it means making unpopular choices. That might even cause hardship in the short term.
Which is a stark contrast to how they view democracy. They see democracy as a system that's easily manipulated by elites to manufacture consent and to advance their own agendas, often at the expense of the greater good.
You got it. And here's where they bring in a more modern-day example that might surprise you. The author actually points to Donald Trump as a figure who briefly disrupted this system but was ultimately contained by these existing power structures.
And they even note that the system seemed to have made peace with Trump by 2024. It's a very interesting take on power dynamics in a democracy.
It really is. And speaking of challenging the status quo, the author doesn't shy away from controversial opinions when it comes to far-right movements and their place in society.
Yeah, this is where I think things get even more
They get a little more
complex.
Right. While acknowledging the need for moderation, the author suggests that far-right movements, and this might sound counterintuitive, might not actually threaten societal order as much as liberal or socialist movements do.
And to illustrate this point, they circle back to the Black Hundreds, claiming that they were ultimately loyal to the Tsar, and had they survived, would have opposed the Bolsheviks. It's a very different perspective from how these groups are often portrayed.
Absolutely. And then they dive into this fascinating analysis of fascism. They see it less as an ideology in itself and more as a temporary tool that nations facing existential threats sometimes resort to.
Almost like a pressure valve.
That's a great analogy. They argue that once stability is restored, fascism naturally fades away, just like it did in Spain and Romania, where fascist regimes eventually transitioned back to monarchies.
Interesting.
They even bring up Mussolini, arguing that he, despite being a fascist dictator, ultimately supported both the Italian monarch and the Pope.
Boy.
And they suggest that Mussolini's creation of the Italian Social Republic later on was less about fascist ideology and more about this desperate attempt to cling to power.
So even the poster child for fascism, in their view, wasn't really a true believer, just a pragmatist using whatever tools were available at the time.
Right, and this brings us to the final part of the article, where the author tackles a concept they call the paradox of progress.
Okay, I'm all ears. What is this paradox all about? So this paradox of progress, what is it?
Well, the author argues that a lot of the social changes that we now consider progress, things like women's suffrage, racial integration, secularization, LGBTQ plus rights, they're actually pretty unpopular when they were first introduced. They claim that these changes were often pushed through by elites, even when the majority of people were against them.
So they're saying that progress isn't always like this bottom-up movement. It's more like, we know better. We're going to do this, even if you don't like it right now.
Exactly, and they even acknowledge that eventually. Society tends to catch up and embrace these changes. Initially, people resist, but then they kind of see the benefits and they come around, though the author seems to make an exception for transgender rights, implying that maybe this is one change that society won't fully embrace.
Interesting. So how does this all tie back to the idea of the monarch as like a restraining force?
It's all about maintaining stability and avoiding upheaval. The author believes the monarch's role is to preserve the existing order, not to engineer radical social change. They see monarchs as a force for continuity, a steady hand at the helm, resisting these sudden shifts in the social fabric, even if those shifts are ultimately for the good.
So in their view, a monarch saying no might actually be a way of protecting society from like unintended consequences. Like maybe those elites pushing for change have good intentions, but they don't fully grasp the potential fallout.
That's how the author seems to see it. And it's fascinating how they weave in their own personal experience here. They admit to being critical of their own constitutional monarch. Remember, they're not a fan of limited monarchies. But they remain loyal because they believe that the monarchy offers a path back to a more traditional order, something they see as impossible in republics like the United States.
So basically, a monarchy, even a flawed one, is better than no monarchy at all. Which kind of leads us to this big question. Is there room for this kind of restraining force, this monarchical no, in today's world?
It's a question that really gets you thinking. Because on the one hand, it's easy to see how a monarch's no could be interpreted as tyranny, like a suppression of the will of the people. But the author makes this really compelling case for it being a form of protection. A shield against rapid societal shifts that might not actually serve the long-term good.
That's like they're arguing for a balance between progress and tradition. But is that even possible in our modern democracies where everything just seems to move so fast?
It's tough to say. And it's important to remember that we're dealing with just one perspective here. History is full of examples of monarchs who abused their power, who used their no to oppress and exploit, not to protect.
Yeah, of course not every monarch is some wise, benevolent ruler looking out for their people.
Exactly. But even so, this idea of leadership that prioritizes long-term stability over short-term popularity, this idea of saying no when it's hard but necessary, that's something worth thinking about, especially in today's world, where everything feels so chaotic and immediate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think this deep dive has definitely given us a lot to chew on. It raises some really important questions about how we make decisions as a society, about who gets to say yes and who gets to say no, and how we balance the need for progress with the need for stability. What stands out to you?
I think for me, it's this idea of the monarch as a restraining force, which again might sound anti-democratic at first glance, but in a world where public opinion can be so easily swayed, where things change so rapidly, maybe there is a case to be made for having some kind of mechanism, some institution or individual whose role it is to kind of pump the brakes, to say, hold on, let's think about the long-term consequences before we make this leap.
That's a fantastic point. So in our modern democracies, who or what could possibly play that role? Is it even possible in a system that's so driven by public opinion? It's like we need a department of the big no.
Right.
Someone whose job it is to say, wait a minute, Are we sure this is a good idea? What about the unintended consequences?
It's a thought-provoking idea, and while the author doesn't really offer any concrete solutions, they leave us grappling with this fundamental tension between the will of the people and the need for wise long-term decision-making.
And I think that's what makes this deep dive so powerful. It doesn't just give us answers. It opens up a whole new set of questions, questions that challenge our assumptions and make us look at the world in a new light.
Exactly. And those are the kinds of questions that can really spark meaningful change.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive.
Indeed. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas.
As always. And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has challenged your assumptions and given you some food for thought. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those deep dives coming. Makes you wonder, in our system, we have things like the Supreme Court, which is often seen as a check on, like, the legislature, and even public opinion. But is that really the same as having, like, a monarch whose entire purpose is to be that restraining force?
That's a really good question. I don't know. It is tricky, and I think that's what I find so fascinating about this article is it doesn't offer any easy answers, which is probably a good thing, because it really forces us to confront some fundamental questions about, power, progress, how we govern ourselves.
Yeah, and it also highlights the importance of perspective.
Right.
Because depending on your worldview, that monarchical no can look like tyranny, or it can look like a safeguard against the tyranny of the majority,
Right.
or even like the tyranny of short-term thinking.
Absolutely. Yeah, and for me, it raises questions about the role of experts and intellectuals in a democracy. The author argues that a lot of these progressive changes that we now celebrate were initially unpopular and driven by these elites who, in their view, were kind of more far-sighted than the general public.
So are they implying that we should just trust these elites to guide us, even if it means going against what most people want? I mean, that's a pretty slippery slope.
It is. It is a slippery slope. And I think that's where healthy skepticism comes in.
Right.
It's not about blindly accepting the author's arguments, or anyone else's for that matter. It's about engaging with these ideas critically, weighing the evidence, considering different perspectives, and ultimately forming your own conclusions.
That's such a crucial point. And it goes back to what makes these deep dives so valuable.
Right.
It's not about being spoon-fed information. It's about sparking those aha moments, those moments where you suddenly see the world in a new light, even if it's a little unsettling or challenges your preconceived notions.
Exactly. And, even if you ultimately disagree with the author's conclusions, I think there's real value in wrestling with these complex ideas. It forces us to think more deeply about, the systems we live in, the assumptions we hold, the choices that we make as individuals and as a society.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, to our listener, we'll leave you with this final thought. In a world that's constantly changing, who or what should play the role of the restraining force? Is it even possible or desirable in a system built on, this idea of popular sovereignty? We don't have the answers. But we hope this deep dive has given you some new questions to ponder.
And perhaps even a new appreciation for the complexities and nuances of history, politics, and, just about everything.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. Keep those brains buzzing.